Before we start, I want to share a heartfelt thank you to those who have sent a donation to our channel. Your kindness truly keeps this little corner of ours alive. If you'd like to support our work too, you can find the link in the first comment. Blessings to you all, and let's get ready for today's story. What Elowen saw: a grey cat at the threshold of her studio, motionless, the yarn forgotten between his paws, his amber eyes fixed on her face with an attention she had not felt directed at her in 4 years. What the cat did: he set the yarn down. He had not done that before. Not once in 5 years. He set it down deliberately, the way a person sets down a glass before standing to speak, and he looked at her. Elowen Vance had been about to do something. She had been about to walk down the long hall of the Vance house, past the parlour with its closed shutters, past the dining room nobody had eaten in since April of the year Thackeray died, and into the bedroom at the end where the nightstand drawer was. She had been thinking about the drawer for 11 days. She had taken the inventory of what was in it 3 times. She had not opened it once. She had been about to open it now. The cat sat in the doorway and did not move. Elowen stood with her hand on the banister at the foot of the stairs. She was 67 years old, a woman of medium height, with silver hair she still wore long and pinned at the nape of her neck, the way she had worn it since 1978. Her hands were a restorer's hands, long-fingered, slightly calloused at the second knuckle of the thumb, ink-marked at the cuticle of the index finger, though she had not opened an ink bottle in 2 years. She wore a soft grey cardigan over a linen shirt the colour of old paper. She was, by any external measure, composed. Internally, she had been preparing to disappear for a long time. She did not call it that. She had not called it anything. She had simply, over the 4 years since Thackeray's death, drawn the perimeter of her life smaller and smaller until it consisted of the kitchen, the upstairs bath, the bedroom, and the studio on the 2nd floor that she had not entered for 18 months. The mansion on East Jones Street, with its 12 rooms and 3 balconies and the wrought iron gate Thackeray had bought at an estate sale in Charleston in 1986, had become something she moved through rather than lived in. The live oaks in the courtyard kept their Spanish moss without her assistance. The camellia bushes Thackeray had planted bloomed each January regardless. She was caretaker of a house that no longer required a caretaker. She had begun to wonder recently whether she did either. The cat had not moved. Elowen looked at him. He looked back. His name was Balthazar, a name Thackeray had given him, with the particular formality Thackeray had reserved for things he had decided to take seriously, and Thackeray had taken Balthazar seriously from the moment he had carried the kitten home from the rescue on Tybee Island 5 years and 7 months ago in the breast pocket of his canvas barn coat. "He's got a face that requires a long name," Thackeray had said. "I won't insult him with anything short." Balthazar was a Nibelung, a breed Elowen had not heard of before Thackeray brought him home, a long-haired silver-blue cat with a dense, smoke-coloured coat and eyes the colour of poured honey. He weighed 12 pounds and carried it with the particular self-possession of an animal who has decided very early in life that he is the senior partner in any room he enters. He had loved Thackeray. He had loved Thackeray with the steady, undemonstrative loyalty of a cat who chooses his person once and does not revisit the decision. When Thackeray had died, Balthazar had not become demonstrative in his grief. He had simply moved his sleeping spot from the foot of Thackeray's side of the bed to the centre of the rug in front of the bedroom door, where he had slept every night since. In the 4 years since, he had behaved like a cat in mourning who had decided to outlast it. He had eaten regularly. He had used his box. He had played once a day with the same red yarn ball Thackeray had bought him at a hardware store on Bull Street in 2020, a ratty thing now, frayed and matted, half unspooled. He played with it in the morning for exactly 11 minutes by the kitchen clock, and then he carried it to his sleeping spot and let it be until the next morning. He had not stopped playing in the middle of his 11 minutes, not once. He had stopped now. What Elowen did not know, the cat had been watching her for 3 days. He had watched her stand at the nightstand without opening the drawer. He had watched her count the pills in the bottle in the bathroom cabinet and put it back. He had watched her sit at the kitchen table with the unopened letter from her sister in Charleston and slide it, unread, into the bin under the sink. He had watched her stop answering the telephone on the third ring instead of the second. He had watched her thin. Cats know weight the way readers know the thickness of a book. He had slept across her legs for 4 years. He knew the angle of her hip bone. He knew when the angle had begun to change. "Say, I." "Balthazar," Elowen said. Her voice in the hallway sounded strange to her. She had not spoken to anyone since Tuesday, and this was Friday, that particular Friday in late October when the heat finally broke over Savannah and the air came in off the river with the smell of salt and wet leaves and the faint, sweet rot of pecans coming down in the cemetery on Abercorn Street. The light through the fanlight over the front door was the soft, slanted gold of 4 in the afternoon. The cat did not move. He sat at the threshold of the studio. The studio door had been closed for 18 months. Elowen had not opened it. The cat had not opened it. He could not. The brass knob was round and offered nothing to a paw, but he had been positioning himself outside it more often in the last week. Elowen had registered this without registering it. She did not understand yet that he had been waiting for her to walk toward the bedroom. She understood only that he had set the yarn down. He had abandoned his 11-minute ritual. He was looking at her with an attention she could feel in her sternum, the way one feels the regard of someone who has known a long time what you are doing and has decided, finally, to say so. She let go of the banister. She walked toward him. The hardwood under her stocking feet was cool and uneven. The floors of the Vance house had been laid in 1873 and had settled into the kind of organic warp that no contemporary tradesman could replicate or, in some cases, repair. She stepped over the loose board outside the parlor without thinking about it. She stopped 2 feet from where Balthazar sat. He looked up at her. His eyes had gold flecks in them that she had not noticed in some time. They were not the eyes of a creature performing alarm. They were the eyes of an examiner. He looked at her the way she herself had once looked, under magnification, at a tear in a 15th century page, with a particular kind of attention, the kind that says, "I see what has happened to you. I am going to consider what needs to be done." "What," Elowen said, "are you doing?" Balthazar did not answer, of course. He stood up. He turned. He walked 4 paces into the studio. Through the threshold he was not supposed to be able to cross because the door was closed, and Elowen looked at the closed door and then realized, with a small lurch of misdirection, that the door was not closed. It was open about 8 inches. She had not opened it. The latch on the studio door had been failing slowly for 3 years. Thackeray had been meaning to fix it. He had bought the brass plate and the small screws and laid them on the bench in the carriage house. He had not gotten to it. The latch had finally given. Sometime in the past 4 days, or perhaps the past 11 days, or perhaps the past month, the door had slipped its catch in a draught and stood open by a hand's width, and Balthazar had begun, in the way of cats, to use the opening. Elowen stood in the hallway and felt the cool air from the studio against her face for the first time in 18 months. She did not go in. She did not yet go in. But she did not go to the bedroom either. She turned and walked back to the kitchen, and Balthazar, after looking at her for one more long moment from inside the studio, came after her, his paws making the small specific tick on the floorboards that she had once been able to identify from any room in the house. He came after her, but slowly. He did not take his eyes off her. He had bought time. He understood that he had bought time. He would need more. What Elowen had been doing in the 4 months before the cat set down the yarn, she had been writing letters she did not send. Not love letters, not exactly, letters of instruction, where the deed to the house was, where Thackeray's grandfather's pocket watch was, which of the books in the parlor should go to her sister in Charleston and which should go to the rare book room at the Telfair Library. Who in the conservator community could be trusted with the unfinished restoration of a 1623 Florentine missal that was in the cedar chest in the studio, wrapped in unbleached muslin, with the work approximately 70% complete and a contract that paid the remaining 30% on delivery? She had drafted the letters. She had not addressed the envelopes. She had told herself, the way people in her condition often tell themselves, that she was simply being prudent. That a woman of 67 living alone in a large house ought to have her papers in order, that this was responsibility, not capitulation. She had told herself this for several months. She had stopped telling herself this in September, when she had walked into the bathroom and counted the pills in the bottle of the prescription she had stopped taking when Thackeray died, and she had counted enough. She had put the bottle back. She had moved it to the nightstand drawer. She had told herself she would think about it. She had been thinking about it for 41 days. This is the woman the cat was watching. But see what the cat did next. He ate dinner. It was 4:30 in the afternoon, which was not his dinner hour. His dinner hour was 6, but he walked to his bowl in the kitchen, and he sat beside it, and he looked at Elowen with the patient expression of a creature who has decided that a small departure from routine on his end will require a small response on hers. Elowen looked at the bowl. The bowl was empty. She had fed him in the morning. The morning food was gone, which was normal. He had eaten it at his usual 10:15, in his usual way, sitting on the small braided rug she had put down for him in 2021 because she had thought then that he might like the warmth. She walked to the cabinet. She took down the can. She opened it. She spooned half the can into the bowl and added a small handful of the dry food he liked and set it down. Balthazar ate. He ate the way he always ate, with the small, fastidious motions of a cat who considers his food a private matter, his back half turned to her, his tail still. He ate the whole portion. He licked the bowl in 2 unhurried sweeps. He sat back. He looked at her again. Then he walked to the back door and stopped. He had not asked to go out in 3 years. He was an indoor cat. He had been an indoor cat since Thackeray had brought him home, after Thackeray had told her, in the particular way Thackeray had, of issuing decisions disguised as observations, that a cat this beautiful gets stolen if you put him out in this city, L. Balthazar sat at the back door and waited. Elowen looked at him. "You don't go out," she said. He looked at her. "You don't go out," she said again. We agreed. He looked at her. He did not move. After a long moment, Elowen walked to the back door. She put her hand on the deadbolt. She turned it. She opened the door. The afternoon came in. It came in the way late October in Savannah comes into a house that has been closed since the morning, the soft, sweet, slightly briny air off the marshes, the green smell of the camellia leaves wet from the morning's brief shower, the high, distant calls of the boat-tailed grackles in the live oaks. It came in like something the house had been waiting for. The kitchen, which had smelled of nothing for months, Elowen had not been cooking, smelled now of outside. Balthazar walked onto the porch. He did not go down the steps. He sat on the top step. He looked at the courtyard, at the iron table she had not cleared since April of the year Thackeray died, at the camellia bushes that had grown over the brick path, at the wrought iron chair where Thackeray had drunk his coffee on weekend mornings, and he looked at it the way a cat looks at a place he has been thinking about. He sat there for 11 minutes. Elowen in the doorway watched him. She did not know at the time that he was making her stand in the open doorway for 11 minutes. She did not know that this was, very specifically, the length of his morning play ritual, that he was, in a manner of speaking, transferring the 11 minutes from one ritual to another, and that the new ritual involved her, and the open air and the late afternoon light on the courtyard she had stopped walking into. She knew only that her face was getting cool, that her hands, which had been cold for some time without her noticing, were warming where they rested on the doorframe, that somewhere down East Jones Street a child was laughing, and the sound was specific and bright and unembarrassed, and it had been a long time since she had heard a child laugh and let the sound stay in her ear. After 11 minutes, Balthazar stood up. He walked back into the kitchen. He stopped at the door. Elowen, after a moment, closed it behind him. What the cat saw when he came back inside, Elowen was crying, not loudly, not in any way she would have admitted to. 2 slow tears down the right side of her face, the kind a person sheds without consenting to. She wiped them with the back of her left hand and did not acknowledge that she had wiped them. What the cat did, he wound, slowly, between her ankles, once, twice, 3 times. He had not done this since Thackeray was alive. It had been one of Thackeray's particular gifts, the way Balthazar had wound between his ankles every evening when he came in from the porch, and Elowen had watched it for years from the kitchen table and felt the small, specific tenderness of being adjacent to a love that did not require her. Now the cat was doing it for her. She stood very still. Then she said, in a voice she did not entirely recognize, "All right." She did not say what she was agreeing to. The cat did not require her to. That night, for the first time in 18 months, Balthazar did not sleep on the rug outside the bedroom. He slept across her feet. Elowen lay in the dark and felt his weight, small and specific and warm, 12 pounds distributed across the bones of her ankles, and she did not sleep for a long time. She listened to the house. She listened to the Gulf wind moving through the eaves and the live oak, rubbing its branch against the gutter on the east side, and the small ticking sound the old pipes made when the temperature dropped through the night. She did not get up to look in the nightstand drawer. She had not, she realized, opened the drawer. The cat had moved his weight onto her feet, and she had not opened the drawer. She did not understand yet that he had done this on purpose. Bad-tai. The next morning was a Saturday. Saturdays in the Vance house had been once the busy day. Thackeray had taught at the Savannah College of Art and Design, drawing and anatomy in the medical illustration program, a department he had run for the last 6 years of his career, and Saturdays had been the day he had given to the house. He had repaired things. He had cooked elaborate breakfasts. He had walked, in the late afternoon, the 4 blocks down to Forsyth Park with whichever of their friends had drifted by that week. Saturdays after Thackeray had become, for Elowen, the worst day. Not Sundays. Sundays were so empty they had become almost peaceful, a country of their own. Saturdays were the day that remembered what it had been. Saturdays had a shape that Elowen could not fill, and so she had stopped trying to fill them, and over 4 years they had become the day she did not get out of her bathrobe. This Saturday, Balthazar woke her at 6:15. He did not yowl. He did not need. He sat on her chest with his front paws on her sternum and his face 6 inches from hers, and he looked at her until she opened her eyes. "What?" Elowen said into the dim. He looked at her. "What time is it?" He looked at her. "Balthazar, it is dark." The light was beginning, in fact, the faint pre-dawn blue at the windows that meant 6 o'clock or thereabouts in October. He had selected the hour with precision. He was not asking for food. He was asking for her attention. She sat up. He moved off her chest and onto the foot of the bed. He sat. He waited. She got out of bed. She did not know yet that this was the point. She walked into the bathroom. She splashed water on her face. She put on her robe. She came back into the bedroom, and Balthazar was no longer on the bed. He was at the bedroom door, sitting, looking back over his shoulder at her. She followed him. She did not yet ask herself why she was following him. He led her down the hall, past the parlor, past the closed dining room, past the foot of the stairs. He stopped at the studio door. The studio door was still open 8 inches. Balthazar walked through it. He stopped just inside. He sat. He turned his head and looked back at her. What Elowen had not entered in 18 months, the studio at the back of the 2nd floor, was the room Thackeray had built for her. He had not built it from scratch. The house had come with the room, an old conservatory that previous owners had glassed in and converted to a sunroom, and then, in the 1950s, made into a sleeping porch. But he had renovated it for her in 2003, when she had taken early retirement from the museum in Atlanta, and they had moved into the Vance house, which had been Thackeray's grandmother's, and which had needed everything. He had pulled up the linoleum and put down old heart pine. He had installed the long north-facing window she required for color work. He had built the workbench himself, an 8-foot oak surface with a marble inlay for solvents, the height of which he had measured against her hip after watching her work for a week. He had wired the room for the particular bright daylight-balanced fixtures she used for fine work. He had built the cedar chest in the corner where she kept the manuscripts in their muslin wraps. She had worked there for 19 years. She had worked in that room on the missal that was still wrapped in muslin in the cedar chest. The Bologna Missal, 1623, vellum, gilt initials in lapis and gold leaf, water damage on folios 14 through 22, commissioned for restoration by a private collector in Charleston who had paid half on signing and had been waiting, with steadily decreasing patience, for the other half of the work for 2 years and 7 months. The collector had stopped calling 14 months ago. Elowen had stopped opening his emails 16 months ago. She had not been able to tell anyone not her sister, not the few friends still calling, that she had not finished the work. That the work was the last thing Thackeray had seen her do. That she had been 7 days from completion when he had been admitted to Memorial Health and had not come home, and that she had not, since, been able to look at the missile without feeling that she had been about to finish something with him in the next room, and that the finishing of it now would be a finishing alone. She had not been able to throw it away either. She had simply closed the door. The door was open now. Balthazar sat inside the room and looked at her. Elowen stepped over the threshold. The studio smelled of cedar and old linseed and the faint chalk smell of the gesso jars on the high shelf. It smelled of work. It smelled very specifically of the years before April of 4 years ago. The morning light through the north window, softer in October than in summer, lower angled, more silvered, fell across the workbench and the marble inlay and the small array of brushes she had left 18 months ago in their ceramic holder. She walked to the bench. The brushes had a fine coat of dust on them. The marble was clean. She had wiped it down the last day. That was her habit. She had never left work without a clean surface, and the natural bristle dusting brush was still set across the right side, where she had always left it. Balthazar walked along the bench and stopped at the cedar chest. He sat. He looked at her. She did not walk out. She walked to the cedar chest. She put her hand on the lid. The wood was cold. She had refinished it herself 11 years ago with a coat of paste wax made from beeswax and orange oil to a recipe she had read in a conservation journal, and the wax had set in the way she had hoped it would, deepening the grain. She lifted the lid. The missile was there, wrapped in unbleached muslin the way she had left it. The contract was there too, in a manila envelope on top, with the collector's name on it in her own handwriting from a long time ago. She did not lift the missile out. Not yet. She stood there with her hand on the wrapped bundle, and Balthazar, who had not, in his entire 5.5 years, been on the workbench, jumped quietly up onto the cedar chest beside the missile. He sat down. He laid one paw, very lightly, on the muslin. He looked up at her. Elowen put her hand over the paw. The paw was warm. It was so small. It was so specifically warm in the cool morning air of the studio that Elowen, 67 alone, 41 days into thinking about the bottle in the nightstand drawer, felt something in her chest move that she had not been able to make move for 4 years. It was not joy. She was not equipped for joy yet. It was a softening, a small, specific softening in a place that had been packed hard for so long she had forgotten the place existed. She kept her hand on his paw for a long time. Then she said out loud, "All right, we can start." She did not know what she meant by we. The cat did. The first week of November came in cool and damp, and Elowen Vance, for the first time in 4 years, kept her studio door open. She did not work the first week. She sat at the bench. She drank her coffee there. She made 1 cup in the mornings and brought it up and drank it slowly, looking at the missile which she had set on the bench in its muslin and not yet unwrapped. Balthazar lay on the workbench beside it. He had decided, the morning after the cedar chest, that the workbench was his now. He had selected the spot. He lay there from 7 in the morning until 11, and then he came down for lunch, and then he came back up after lunch and lay there until 4. He did not interfere with the bench. He did not knock things over. He was, Elowen realized by the end of the first week, supervising. What the cat saw in the first week, Elowen ate breakfast. She had not been eating breakfast. She had been making coffee and drinking it standing at the kitchen window and then drifting through the day with the small, persistent hunger of a body whose owner has stopped negotiating with it. The cat had watched this for 18 months and made no comment because the cat had not yet been operating in negotiation mode. He had been waiting. Now he sat on the kitchen counter, a place he had not previously sat, and he watched her drink her coffee. He watched her until she put the coffee down. Then he walked to the cabinet where the cereal was. He sat in front of the cabinet. He looked at her. "You don't eat cereal," Elowen said. He looked at her. She opened the cabinet. She took out the cereal. She poured herself a bowl. She ate it, standing at the counter, because she was not ready to sit at the table where she and Thackeray had eaten breakfast for 19 years. But she ate it. Balthazar watched her finish the bowl. Then he jumped down and walked away, the matter concluded. Before we continue, I want to take a moment to talk to you. These stories exist because of this community, because of you. And right now, YouTube has denied our monetization, which means the only thing keeping Paws and Whispers alive is the love you have for these stories. If our videos have ever made you feel something, if they've brought you comfort, joy, or just a moment of peace, consider making a small donation. Even the minimum makes a huge difference to us. The link is pinned in the comments below. Thank you for being here. The first practical conflict arrived on Wednesday. The phone rang at 10 in the morning, which was Caldwell's hour. Caldwell was her sister's son, a man of 42 who lived in Atlanta and ran an insurance brokerage and had, since Thackeray's death, taken upon himself the project of managing his aunt. He called every other Wednesday at 10. Eloan had been letting the calls go to the machine for several months. This Wednesday, she did not entirely decide to pick up. She was in the kitchen. The phone was on the wall by the back door. Balthazar was in the kitchen with her, and when the phone rang, Balthazar, who had never in his life paid attention to the telephone, walked to the wall and sat under it and looked at her. "No," Eloan said. He looked at her. "Balthazar." "No." He looked at her. She picked up the phone. "Aunt Elle," Caldwell said. "It's good to hear your voice." "Hello, Caldwell." There was a short pause. Caldwell was, Eloan thought, recalibrating. He had not expected the call to be answered. He had a voice he used for the machine and a voice he used for her in person, and the in-person voice was warmer but came with more freight. "I'm glad I caught you," he said. "I wanted to talk about a couple of things. Are you free for a moment?" She said she was. Caldwell talked. He talked for 11 minutes by the kitchen clock. Eloan noticed the 11 minutes, she had become attentive to 11s, about a brochure he was sending her, about a community in Pooler with cottages and a wellness program and 24-hour staff, about how the Vance house was a great deal to manage, about how he had spoken to a realtor friend who could give her some preliminary figures with no obligation, about how he was not trying to push her, he just wanted her to have options. Eloan listened. When Caldwell finished, she said, "I'm not selling the house, Caldwell. I'm not asking you to sell the house. I'm asking you to look at the brochure." "I'll look at the brochure." "Aunt Elle." "I'll look at the brochure, Caldwell." There was another pause. Caldwell said, in the voice he had used to her at the funeral, in the voice of a man who genuinely loved his aunt and did not know how to talk to her, "Are you all right? I've been worried." Eloan looked down. Balthazar was sitting at her feet. He was looking up at her. His amber eyes were patient and undramatic, and Eloan felt she would not have been able to explain this to Caldwell, and did not try, that the cat was witnessing the call, that he was, in a particular sense, present for it, that he was waiting to see what she would say. "I'm managing," Eloan said. It was the first time in many months she had said that without feeling she was lying. She did not, of course, mention the bottle in the drawer. She did not mention that she had not opened the drawer in 5 days. She did not mention that she had stood the night before at the open door of the drawer and had looked at it and had closed it again and had gone back to the bedroom where the cat was waiting on the foot of the bed. She said she was managing, and she meant it, partially, for the first time. Caldwell, who was not a stupid man, heard the partial truth and let it pass. "I'll mail the brochure tomorrow," he said. "All right. And, Aunt Elle, I'm going to come down next month sometime. I'd like to see you." She did not say no. She said, "I'll let you know what weekend works." When she hung up, Balthazar stood up and walked to the studio door and stopped and looked back at her. The brochure arrived on Saturday. It was glossy. Pooler, Georgia, a community called Magnolia Run, photographs of cottage porches and craft rooms, and a dining hall lit by what appeared to be hundreds of small lamps, where the next chapter starts in a community that feels like home. Eloan sat at the kitchen table with the brochure open and read it through twice. Caldwell had paper-clipped a note to the front. "No pressure. Just take a look." She looked. She looked at the photograph of the cottage interior, a small living room, white walls, a single armchair, no bookshelves visible, and she tried to imagine herself in it. She tried to imagine the workbench. There was no room for the workbench. She tried to imagine the cedar chest. There was no room for the cedar chest. She tried to imagine Balthazar on the workbench supervising. There was no room for Balthazar. She closed the brochure. She did not throw it away. She put it in the drawer of the sideboard with the unopened utility bills and the catalogues from the museum store and the things she did not yet know what to do with. She did not yet know what to do with Caldwell either, but she had a clearer sense now of what she did not want to do. She did not want to leave the house. She had not, until that moment, articulated a want about anything since April of 4 years ago. She wrote it down on the back of an envelope. I do not want to leave the house. She did not know whether she had written it as a reminder to herself or as a defense against Caldwell, but she folded the envelope and tucked it into the pocket of her cardigan, and she did not throw it away. Balthazar on the kitchen counter watched. Wanusau inostai. The first real obstacle came the second week of November. The furnace failed at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday night. Savannah does not, as a rule, get cold. It gets damp. It gets grey. In November, it gets the particular sea-level chill of a coastal city in the dark, never severe but pervasive, the kind that settles into old houses with no insulation and makes the floorboards uncomfortable to walk on without socks. The Vance house had a converted oil furnace from 1962 that Thackeray had nursed along for years and that Elowen had, since Thackeray, not thought about. It had been running. That had been sufficient. It stopped at 3 in the morning. Elowen woke at 4:30 to a cold she could feel on her face. The bedroom was 60 degrees, then 58, then 55 by the time she sat up and understood what had happened. She got out of bed in the dark. The hardwood was cold through her socks. She walked to the thermostat. The display was blank. She stood in the dark hallway. She did not know who to call. This is the small, specific paralysis of a long, isolated person. At the moment, something practical breaks. The world goes on, furnaces go out, pipes leak, roofs fail. But when you have spent 4 years contracting the perimeter of your life until it includes no one, the practical breakage produces a second, harder problem. The simple act of asking for help has become a thing the muscles no longer remember. Elowen stood in the hallway and felt very old. Balthazar came down the stairs. She had not heard him. He had been on the bed. He had, evidently, woken when she had. She would learn later that this was true, that he had been waking with her since the morning he had set the yarn down and had come down after her. He stopped at her feet. He looked up. She looked at him. "The furnace is out," she said, the saying it out loud to him, which was a thing she had begun doing in the past 2 weeks, talking to him about practical matters, the weather, what she was making for lunch, things she would not have thought herself the sort of person to do, made the situation clearer. It clarified. She walked back to the bedroom. She pulled the duvet off the bed. She wrapped it around her shoulders. She walked to the kitchen. She heated water on the gas stove. She made a thermos of tea. She put on a wool sweater over her nightgown and her slippers, and she sat at the kitchen table and watched the light begin to come up. Balthazar got up on the table, a place he was not allowed in principle, though she had stopped enforcing the rule, and sat on her left, his body warm against her elbow, and she let him. At 7, she called Mrs. Sterling. Mrs. Sterling was the neighbor. She lived in the smaller, narrower Italianate house immediately east of the Vance property, and she had lived there for 38 years. She was 71. She was a widow. Her husband had died in 2014, and she and Elowen had been, for many years, the kind of neighbors who waved over the fence and exchanged pleasantries at the mailboxes and had occasionally borrowed each other's eggs and gardening shears. They had not been friends. They had not been not friends. They had been the particular East Jones Street category of adjacent and respectful, which in Savannah is a relationship more durable than it sounds. Mrs. Sterling had attended Thackeray's funeral. She had come back from it with a small foil-wrapped pan of cornbread and a card, and she had set them on Elowen's porch and rung the bell once and not waited. Elowen had not since asked her in for anything. Now, Elowen sat in her kitchen wrapped in a duvet and dialed the number. "Iris," she said. "This is Elowen Vance." There was the small startle of a woman who has not received the call she would never have expected. Then Mrs. Sterling, Iris Sterling, said in a voice notably warmer than Elowen had remembered it, "Elowen, are you all right? My furnace is out. I don't know who to call." "Oh, honey, hold on. I have a name." She gave Elowen the name. Roy Cooley, on the south side, who had fixed her own furnace twice, and who would come out same day if you said his daughter's name had given you the number. Iris also said, and this was the thing Elowen had not expected, that she would come over right now and sit with her while she waited. "You don't have to do that," Elowen said. "I know I don't," Iris said. "I'd like to." Iris Sterling came through the back gate at 7:20 in a long camel coat over a flannel nightgown, carrying a thermos of her own and a quilted bag with what turned out to be 2 croissants she had been planning to thaw for her own breakfast. She came in through the back porch the way she would have come in years ago, if invited, and she set the thermos on the kitchen table and the croissants on a plate she found in the cabinet without asking, and she sat down across from Elowen. She did not, Elowen noticed, make a fuss. She did not say, "Oh, you poor thing," or "let me look at you," or any of the things Elowen had been preparing to deflect. She said, "Roy is coming at 9. He's reliable. The house is going to be cold for 2 hours. She poured tea from her thermos into the cup Elowen had brought down. "I'm sorry to bother you," Elowen said. "You didn't bother me. I was awake." Balthazar, who had been sitting on the table, walked across to Iris and sat in front of her and looked at her. Iris looked back at him. "Hello," she said to the cat. Balthazar held the look for a moment. Then he stepped forward, very precisely, and pressed his forehead once against the back of Iris's hand. He had not done this with anyone since Thackeray. Iris, who had had cats her whole life, did not over-respond. She turned her hand and let him rub his cheek along her thumb, and she said in a quiet voice, "Aren't you a serious one?" Elowen watched them. She watched the way Balthazar accepted Iris. She watched the way Iris accepted Balthazar. She watched a small, undramatic transaction occur in her kitchen between 2 creatures who had taken each other's measure and concluded that the matter was settled. It occurred to Elowen, with the clarity of cold air, that the cat had been preparing for this too. Died. What Balthazar did, while Roy Cooley was in the basement, he sat at the top of the basement stairs. He had not, in his life, been in the basement. The basement was Thackeray's territory, had been Thackeray's territory, and the door at the top of the stairs had been closed for 4 years. It had stayed closed because there was nothing in the basement Elowen needed, and because going down there involved the small particular grief of seeing Thackeray's workbench, his tools, the canvas barn coat hanging on its nail. She had not done it. When Roy had asked to be shown down, Iris had said, "I can take him," and Elowen had said in a voice that surprised her, "No, I'll do it." She had opened the door. She had turned on the light. She had walked Roy down the wooden steps, past the workbench and the tools and the coat on its nail, and into the boiler room at the back of the basement where the old oil furnace stood. And she had stood there with him while he ran his hand along the casing and said, "Yeah, sensor's gone, easy fix." She had come back up alone, leaving Roy to it, and she had found Balthazar at the top of the stairs, sitting upright, watching the open door. He had been waiting for her to come back up. He had been keeping the door open in a way the door could not keep itself open. Elowen sat down on the top step. Balthazar climbed into her lap. He had not done that before. He was not a lap cat. He was a workbench cat, a foot-of-the-bed cat, a sit-at-a-respectful distance cat. He was not a lap cat. He was a lap cat now. She put her hand on his back. His coat was dense and slightly cool from the draft up the basement stairs, and she could feel the small, steady drum of his purr, which she had not, she realized, heard at this volume before. He was purring at her. She sat on the step and let him purr. In the kitchen, Iris was rinsing the cups in the sink, the way a woman rinses cups in someone else's kitchen when she does not want to be a guest and does not want to be a stranger and is trying to be the third thing, which is a neighbor who has come over before the furnace person and is making herself useful. Elowen, with the cat in her lap, said quietly to the top of his head, "All right, I see what you're doing." The cat, who had been doing it for 2 weeks now, made no comment. Mawid. The furnace was fixed by 11. Roy charged her $240, which was reasonable for same day, and he accepted a check, and he told her that the furnace had, in his estimation, perhaps 3 more years in it before it would need to be replaced entirely. He said this kindly. He said it the way you tell an old person something practical so that she has time to prepare. Elowen thanked him. She walked him to the front door. She watched him drive away. She came back into the kitchen, and Iris was still there. Iris had cleared the table. Iris had washed the cups and put them on the drying rack. Iris had also, Elowen saw with a small inward flinch, opened the refrigerator and was looking at the contents of it. The refrigerator contained a half carton of eggs of uncertain age, a quart of milk past its date, 3 small containers of leftover takeout from the Greek place on Whitaker, a jar of olives, 2 oranges, and 4 bottles of mineral water. Iris closed the refrigerator. "Elawan," she said. "I know." "All right. I haven't been shopping," I figured. Iris turned and looked at her. Iris Sterling had blue eyes that had faded in the way blue eyes fade, and white hair cut short, and the particular composure of a woman who had raised 3 children and buried a husband, and had learned somewhere along the way to say difficult things without making them dramatic. "I'm going to the Kroger at 1, Iris said. "I'd like company." Elawan opened her mouth to say no. She looked at Balthazar. Balthazar was sitting on the kitchen counter, watching her. She closed her mouth. "All right," she said. "The Kroger on Mall Boulevard at 1 in the afternoon on a Tuesday is not a difficult place. It is fluorescent and orderly. It has the particular Tuesday quiet of mid-afternoon in mid-November, retirees and shift workers, and the occasional young mother with a toddler in the cart." Elawan had not been in it for 14 months. She had been having groceries delivered. The delivery boy left them on the porch, and she carried them in, and she did not have to look at anyone. She walked through the front doors with Iris and stopped. The lights were very bright. The music was very mild. The air conditioning was very cold for November. She stood with her hand on the cart and felt, for a moment, the particular vertigo of a person who has been indoors too long and is now confronted with the colors and sounds of a public place, and finds, to her surprise, that she is not actually equipped for them. Iris beside her did not comment. Iris walked. They moved through the produce section. Iris bought oranges and pears and a bunch of celery and a small wedge of butternut squash and a head of romaine. She did this without commentary, the way a person shops who has been shopping for 50 years and does not require small talk about it. She did not ask Elawan what she was buying. She let Elawan find her own pace. In the bread aisle, Elawan put a loaf of sourdough in her cart. She had not bought bread in months. She had not been eating bread. She had been eating, when she ate, the spare and stripped-down food of a woman who had stopped negotiating with her own appetite. Sourdough was a thing you bought when you intended to make a sandwich. It was a thing you bought when you intended to have someone over. She put it in the cart. She did not yet have a plan for the sourdough. She bought butter as well. She bought cheese. She bought eggs that were not the eggs from her own old carton. She bought a small piece of salmon and lemons and a bunch of parsley. She walked through the aisles and bought food the way she had bought food before April of 4 years ago, which is to say, with the assumption that there would be cooking and that the cooking would be for at least one person. She bought, in the pet aisle, a new red yarn ball. She had not planned to. She passed the cat toys on the way to the laundry detergent, and she saw the red yarn balls in their bin, and she stopped. The old one in Balthazar's sleeping spot was nearly bald. He had played with it for 5 years. He had been playing with it on the afternoon he set it down to look at her. She picked up a new one. She turned it in her fingers. She put it in the cart. Iris saw her do this and said nothing, in the particular careful way Iris had been saying nothing since 7 that morning. What Iris did not know, what Elawan had not yet found a way to tell anyone. That morning, before the furnace had failed, Elawan had walked to the nightstand in the dark. She had opened the drawer. She had taken the bottle out. She had held it in her hand for a long moment in the dim of the bedroom, with Balthazar asleep across her feet at the end of the bed. She had felt the weight of it. She had felt the rattle of it. She had walked in her socks down to the kitchen. She had emptied the bottle into the disposal. She had run the water. She had run the disposal. She had stood at the sink and listened to the sound of pills going into the city's wastewater for a long time until the disposal made the small, final whine of a thing that had ground everything it had to grind. She had rinsed the empty bottle. She had put it in the recycling. She had gone back upstairs. Balthazar had not moved off her feet or eyes. When she came back from the Kroger, she made soup. She made it because Iris had bought celery and Elawan had bought the squash, and the two of them together would not keep, and you do not buy celery and squash in November and not make soup. She made it because Thackeray had loved her soup. She made it because Balthazar was on the kitchen counter watching her, and the watching had a quality of expectation she did not yet want to disappoint. She made it slowly. She had not made soup in 2.5 years, and her hands remembered the motions before her mind did. The peeling of the squash, the dicing of the onion, which made her cry the way it always had, and which she was, for the first time in a long time, grateful for, because it was a crying with a known cause and a known end. The slow brown of the onion in butter at the bottom of the heavy pot, the smell rising. The smell of soup in the Vance kitchen. It had been a long time. Balthazar on the counter half closed his eyes. She ladled the soup into a bowl at 6. She sat down at the kitchen table, not at the counter, and she ate it slowly. The kitchen window was dark already. Late November in Savannah goes dark at 5:15. She ate the whole bowl, and then she ate half of a second bowl, and then she put the rest in the refrigerator in a glass container, and she labeled it with masking tape and the date the way she had always labeled leftovers, and she set it on the second shelf where there was now empty space because she had thrown out the takeout containers earlier that afternoon. She washed the bowl. She dried it. She put it away. Balthazar, who had eaten his own dinner at 6:15, was already on the workbench upstairs, waiting for her. She did not, that night, work on the missile. She did, that night, walk into the studio and stand at the bench and unwrap the muslin and look at the missile for the first time in 2 years. The water damage on folios 14 through 22 was as she had left it, half treated. The lapis on folio 17 was intact. The gilt on folio 19 had a small flake at the corner of the initial that she had stabilized but not yet replaced. She remembered, with the specificity of muscle memory, the order of the next operations. She remembered which solvent. She remembered which brush. She remembered which light. She did not, that night, perform any of them. She rewrapped the missile. She set it back on the bench. She put her hand on it briefly, and she said to no one in particular, "Tomorrow." Balthazar, on the bench beside it, blinked slowly at her. The first week of December came in with a small, flat cold front, and Elowen began to work again. She worked an hour a day at first, just an hour. She set the kitchen timer and brought it upstairs and put it on the bench, and she worked until it rang. The hands shook, the first 3 days. She had not held a fine sable brush in 2 years, and the small, precise muscles of the wrist and the second finger had to be retaught what they had once known. She worked through the shaking. The shaking gradually stopped. Balthazar lay on the bench while she worked. He laid his chin on her right hand, sometimes the hand that was not holding the brush. He laid it lightly. He did not interfere. He simply put his chin on the back of her wrist and breathed there, and Elowen, who had not been physically near another living thing in any sustained way for years, felt the small, warm weight of him at her pulse and let her hand steady against it. After the second week, she was working 2 hours. After the third week, she was working 3. Iris came over on Thursdays for tea. The Thursdays had become a thing. They had not been declared. Iris had come over on a Thursday with a box of pastries the second week, and Elowen had made tea, and they had sat at the kitchen table for an hour and not said anything difficult, and the next Thursday, Iris had simply arrived again at the same time and brought a different box, and by the third Thursday, Elowen had made cucumber sandwiches in advance, and they were a habit. They did not talk about Thackeray. They did not talk about Iris's husband. They talked about Iris's tomato plants, which she was preparing for the winter, and about the renovation of the Owens-Thomas house, which Elowen had read about in the paper, and about Iris's grandson in Charleston, who was applying to medical school, and about Balthazar, who they both watched, and who supervised the Thursdays with the patient interest of a maitre d' who has decided to allow them to use the room. In the fourth Thursday of this arrangement, Iris said without preamble, over her second cup of tea, "I'm glad you called me, El." Elowen looked at her. "I was at the point," Iris said, "of not knowing how to come over." Elowen did not say anything for a moment. She said, "I'm glad you came." Iris nodded once. The tea cooled. The cat slept on the windowsill. Outside, the live oaks dropped their dry leaves in the dry gold December light, and a Savannah December afternoon arrived in the way Savannah Decembers arrive, which is to say, slowly and without fanfare, like a quiet guest. The second practical conflict was the boy. His name was Thackeray. This was the first time she saw it on the envelope, almost more than Elowen could bear. The envelope had arrived in the mail in October, 6 days before Balthazar had set down the yarn, and she had let it sit on the side table for 11 days. She had not opened it. She had registered the name on the return address and the local Savannah postmark, and she had decided, without quite deciding, that opening the envelope was a thing she would do later. She had eventually opened it on a Wednesday in November, after Iris's first Thursday. Inside had been a letter, handwritten, in a careful and slightly uneven hand, from a 14-year-old boy at the Public Arts Magnet School on East Anderson Street. His name was Thackeray Bell. He was working on a school project for his sophomore art history elective. The project involved studying a regional artist or craftsperson and writing a paper and making, if possible, a small piece of original work in their tradition. His teacher had mentioned that there was a manuscript restorer in Savannah named Elowen Vance who had once done a public lecture at the Telfair on medieval gilding techniques. He was wondering, the boy wrote, if Mrs. Vance might possibly be willing to speak with him for 1 hour about her work. He had been named, the letter mentioned, after his great-uncle. He included his phone number and the email address of his mother, in case Mrs. Vance preferred to coordinate that way. Elowen had folded the letter and put it back in the envelope and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She had not then replied. She had not then been able to. Balthazar found the letter on the morning of December 10th. It had migrated, in the way papers do, from the side table to the kitchen counter to the top of the small stack of correspondence Elowen had been carrying around for several weeks without addressing. The cat sat on the stack. He pawed at the corner of the envelope until it slid out. Then he batted the envelope, with one efficient motion, off the counter and onto the kitchen floor. Elowen picked it up. "You did that on purpose," she said. He looked at her. She took the letter to the phone. The mother answered. Her name was Marisol Bell. She was, Elowen learned over the course of the next 15 minutes, a single mother who worked at the medical center, and her son Thackeray was a quiet, careful boy who liked old things and drew constantly and had been wanting to write Mrs. Vance for some weeks before he had worked up the nerve. Marisol Bell was warm but careful on the phone. She was, Elowen recognized, a woman who had been told no by several people on her son's behalf and was prepared this time for it as well. Elowen said, "I'd be glad to meet him." There was a small pause on the other end. Then Marisol Bell said, Oh, thank you. Thank you. They arranged a Saturday. When Elowen hung up, Balthazar was on the kitchen counter again, looking at her with the steady amber regard she had come to recognize as approval. "Yes," she said. "All right. You were right." He blinked slowly. "Oh." The boy arrived at 10 on a Saturday morning in the middle of December in a navy peacoat that was a size too big for him and that had clearly belonged to someone else first. He was tall for 14 and thin in the angular way of 14-year-old boys, with dark curly hair and serious dark eyes and a notebook clutched against his chest with both arms. He looked, Elowen thought from the porch, terrified. She let him in. She had been thinking for 3 days about how to receive him. She had been thinking about the name. She had been thinking about whether the name was going to undo her. She had decided, on the 3rd day, that the name was the boy's name and not her husband's, and that the boy had not chosen it, and that the boy deserved to be received as himself. He stood in the front hall in his too large peacoat and looked up at the chandelier. "Wow," he said. "It's a lot of chandelier," Elowen said. "My husband bought it at an estate sale in 1986. He could never resist a chandelier." The boy looked at her. "That's my name," he said. "Thackeray." "I know. My mom told you?" "Your letter told me." He looked down at his shoes. They were beat-up sneakers, the kind a 14-year-old has been wearing for a year past their useful life. "I didn't know if it was weird to write that," he said. "I didn't know if I should have." "It wasn't weird," Elowen said. "Come in. I want to show you the studio." She walked him up the stairs. Balthazar was on the workbench, where he had been since 7. He looked up when they came in. He looked at the boy. The boy stopped in the doorway. "Whoa," he said. "Hi." Balthazar regarded him. Then Balthazar, who had taken almost 2 weeks to physically approach Iris, who had taken 5 years to approach Elowen in the way he had finally approached her, got up off the workbench. He walked along the edge of it. He stepped onto the small stool at the end. He stepped down onto the floor. He walked across the studio. He stopped at the boy's feet. He looked up. The boy, very slowly, crouched down. He held out the back of his hand. Balthazar pressed his forehead once against the back of the boy's hand. The boy, who had been holding himself very still in the way nervous teenagers do, said in a small voice, "Oh, he likes you," Elowen said. The boy looked up at her with the wide, unguarded expression of a 14-year-old who is being met for once exactly where he is. "He really does," Elowen said. She showed him the missile. She unwrapped the muslin on the workbench, and she showed him the gilt initials and the lapis and the water damage on the folios she had been working on. She explained gold leaf. She explained gesso. She explained what a binder was and what a pigment was and why the lapis from Afghanistan had been worth more than gold in the 15th century. She showed him the small array of brushes and the magnifying lens and the particular daylight-balanced lamp Thackeray had wired into the bench in 2003. The boy listened. He asked careful, specific questions. He took notes. He took notes the way someone takes notes who is going to look at the notes later. He was there for 2 hours. When his mother came to pick him up, the boy stood on the porch and looked at Elowen with the same wide expression he had worn in the studio and said, "Can I come back?" "Yes," Elowen said. She did not, at the time, understand how much she meant it. He came back the following Saturday. He came back the Saturday after that. By the third Saturday, Balthazar was on the bench when he arrived, and the boy had brought a small wrapped package, a square of mat board, and a few colored pencils he had used to make, in his own hand, a rough copy of one of the gilt initials from the missile. He had done it from a photo. The proportions were uneven, and the gilding had been done with a metallic marker, and Elowen, who had spent 43 years working in the most precise possible terms, with the most precise possible materials, looked at it with a feeling she had not had in a long time, which was the feeling of being moved. "It's good," she said. "It's not. It's good for a first try. It's actually quite good. Come here." She showed him, on the bench, how to lay a piece of gold leaf. She had not laid gold leaf in 2 years. Her hands shook for the first attempt, and she did not hide it from him, because the boy was the kind of boy who would notice anyway, and the boy was the kind of boy who would respect being told the truth. She said, "My hands shake sometimes. I haven't done this in a while." "Why?" "My husband died." He was quiet. "He was your great-uncle?" she asked. The boy nodded. "I never met him," he said. "He would have liked you," Elowen said. The boy looked down at the gold leaf on the bench. "My mom said he was an artist. He was a draftsman. Anatomy and medical illustration. He taught at SCAD. What was he like?" Elowen thought about the question. Balthazar on the bench watched her. "He was a patient man," she said. "He liked old things. He had a particular laugh. He fixed everything in this house, and he never finished any of it. He named the cat." The boy looked at Balthazar. "What's his name?" "Balthazar." The boy laughed. He laughed in the surprised, unguarded way of 14-year-olds, and Elowen, who had not heard a child laugh in her own house in many years, felt the sound settle into the studio the way light settles into a room that has been dark. "That's a really long name for a cat," the boy said. "It is. It suits him." "He picked it." "He picked it?" "He picked it the way cats pick things," Elowen said. "He arrived in this house, and he behaved like a Balthazar, and so we called him a Balthazar, and the matter was concluded." The boy laughed again. Balthazar, on the workbench, half closed his eyes in the cat equivalent of taking a bow. The fourth obstacle was the cat himself. It was the middle of January, and Savannah had had 3 weeks of the kind of grey weather that flattens everything. Elowen had been working 4 hours a day on the missile. Iris had been coming on Thursdays. The boy had been coming on Saturdays. Caldwell had visited in early December, had seen the kitchen with a pot of soup on the stove, and the cat on the workbench, and the boy's gilt practice on the bench beside the missile, and had not mentioned the brochure again. He had hugged her, hard, in the doorway when he left, and said, "I'm glad I came, Aunt El." She had said, "Me too." This had been true. Then on a Tuesday morning in mid-January, Balthazar did not come down for breakfast. He did not come down at 6:15. He did not come down at 6:30. At 6:45, Eloan, who had been in the kitchen with the coffee made and his bowl already set out, climbed the stairs and found him on the foot of the bed, in his old spot, in the precise center of the duvet. He was lying down, his eyes were open. He was watching the door. He did not get up when she came in. "Balthazar," she said. He did not move. She crossed the room. She sat on the edge of the bed. She put her hand on him. His coat was warm. His breathing was a little fast. He looked at her with eyes that were not dimmed but were watchful in a way she had not seen. She felt then the small specific fear of someone who had let themselves love something again. She drove him to the vet. The vet was a woman she had not seen before, because the vet she and Thackeray had used had retired in 2022 and Eloan had not arranged a replacement. She drove to the practice on Bull Street that had a sign in the window saying, "Walk-ins welcome," and she carried Balthazar in his old carrier, the one Thackeray had bought in 2020, which Balthazar had always tolerated with grim patience, and she sat in the waiting room for 40 minutes. She had not, until that morning, understood how much of her newly assembled life was hanging on the small grey cat in the carrier. The vet was named Dr. Carwyn Page. She was 40, dark-haired, with the calm, specific manner of someone who had spent her professional life delivering both good news and difficult news in the same tone. She examined Balthazar. She drew blood. She ran her hand along his belly. She looked in his mouth. She looked at his teeth. She said, "He's a little dehydrated. I think he may have a urinary tract issue. We're going to do a urinalysis and an ultrasound. It's probably nothing serious, but I want to be thorough." Eloan, in the small examination room, said, "All right." Her voice was steady. It was not, on the inside, steady at all. The diagnosis was a stone. It was small. It was, Dr. Page explained, extremely treatable. They would need to keep him overnight, possibly 2 nights, to flush the system and to do a minor procedure. He would come home with a special diet and would need to be monitored for recurrence. He was, Dr. Page said, in the bigger picture, a very healthy 5-year-old cat with a very common problem. Eloan, in the consultation room, said, "All right." She said, "I'm going to leave him with you." She said, "Please call me with any updates." She drove home. She came into the empty house at noon and stood in the front hall and listened. The house was quiet. The house was quiet in the particular way it had not been quiet in 3 months. There were no small paws on the floorboards. There was no small specific weight on the workbench upstairs. There was no warm body waiting on the foot of the bed. The house was a Vance house, with its 12 rooms and its 3 balconies and its live oaks in the courtyard, and for the first time in 3 months, it was a house Eloan Vance was alone in. She sat down on the bottom step of the stairs. She cried. She cried in the way she had not cried in 4 years, not at the funeral, not at the wake, not in any of the long nights since. She cried the way a person cries who has been holding herself together very carefully for a long time and has just been reminded of what it is she has been holding herself together for. She cried for 10 minutes. Then she got up. She walked to the kitchen. She washed her face at the sink. She picked up the phone. She called Iris. Iris came over. Iris brought a casserole, which made Eloan laugh in a watery way, because of course Iris had brought a casserole. That was what Iris did. They sat at the kitchen table. They ate the casserole. Iris did not ask if Eloan was all right. Iris simply sat with her and let the quiet be what it was. After dinner, Iris said, "Do you want me to stay tonight?" Eloan thought about it. She said, "No, I think I need to do it, but thank you." Iris nodded. She left at 8. Eloan went upstairs. She walked in the dark to the bedroom. She sat on the edge of the bed in Balthazar's spot. She put her hand on the duvet where he should have been. The duvet was cool. She did not, that night, go to the nightstand drawer. She did not need to. The drawer was empty. The drawer had been empty for 2 months. The bottle had been ground down into Savannah's wastewater, and the empty container had been picked up by the recycling truck on the last Tuesday of November, and the woman who had stood at the kitchen sink and emptied it was a woman who had decided that morning, in a way she had not been able to put into words then, and could not put into words now, that she had been wrong about what she wanted. She had wanted to stay. She had wanted, very specifically, to stay. She slept on the foot of the bed, in Balthazar's spot. She did not sleep well, but she slept. Balthazar came home on Thursday afternoon. Dr. Page handed him over in a clean carrier with a bag of the new food and a written care plan and a small bill that Elowen paid without flinching. He was quiet on the drive home. He sat in the carrier in the passenger seat and looked at the road, the way Thackeray had always said, cats looked at roads they have driven 1,000 times. Elowen carried him in through the front door. She set the carrier down in the front hall. She opened the door. Balthazar stepped out. He looked around. He walked, slowly, the length of the front hall, past the parlor, past the dining room, past the foot of the stairs. He stopped at the studio door. The door was open. He walked through it. He resumed. It is the simplest word for it. He resumed. He resumed his morning 11 minutes with the yarn ball, the new red one Elowen had bought at the Kroger, which he had accepted without ceremony as soon as she had set it down beside his sleeping spot, the old one having been put away in the cedar chest with the missile, because she had not been able to throw it out. He resumed his workbench supervision. He resumed his foot of the bed sleeping. He resumed waking her at 6:15. He had been gone 2 days. The 2 days had been enough. She had spent the second night on the foot of the bed. She had spent the day at the kitchen table making lists, because lists were a thing she could do. She had made a list of the missile's remaining operations in order with estimated hours. A list of Iris's grandson's medical school deadlines, which Iris had mentioned in passing and which Elowen had decided on impulse to remember. A list of materials young Thackeray would need for his project. A list of phone calls that needed to be made. The first phone call she had made on Thursday morning was to the collector in Charleston. He had been surprised to hear from her. He had been more surprised when she had told him that the missile would be finished, with photographs of the work, within 90 days. He had said, in a voice that was warmer than she had remembered it, "Mrs. Vance, I had thought. I know what you had thought. I'm very glad to be wrong." "So am I," Elowen said. "So am I." The missile was finished on the 28th of February. Elowen took the photographs herself on the workbench in the late afternoon light through the north window, with Balthazar in his usual spot at the corner of the bench. The gilt initials on folios 14 through 22 had been restored. The water damage had been treated. The lapis on folio 17, which had been the most difficult restoration, had been brought back to a saturation that Elowen, looking at it under the daylight lamp, thought was perhaps a quarter shade lighter than the original. The collector would not notice. She noticed. She decided she could live with it. She wrapped the missile in fresh muslin. She packed it in the conservation crate she had built for it in 2019. She mailed it by registered courier on the 1st of March. The collector mailed her the second half of the payment on the 5th. She framed the check before she cashed it. She did not actually frame it. She held it for a long time. She showed it to Balthazar, who blinked slowly. She showed it to Iris, who clapped her hands once, which was a thing Iris did when she was pleased. She showed it to young Thackeray on a Saturday, and he held it carefully in both hands and said, "Mrs. Vance, that's a lot of money." "It is. What are you going to do with it?" She thought about it. "I think," she said, "I'm going to buy supplies. I think I'm going to start taking new work." The boy looked at her. "You're going to keep doing it?" he said. "I'm going to keep doing it." He smiled. It was the boy who said, eventually, what no one else had said. It was the second Saturday in March. He was in the studio with her. He had brought, as he had taken to bringing on Saturdays, his sketchbook and a small pastry from the bakery on Bull Street that he had begun bringing for Elowen because he had noticed the third Saturday that she had not been eating breakfast. Elowen had begun this Saturday to teach him about pigment grinding. He was watching Balthazar, who was on the bench in his spot. He said, "Mrs. Vance." "Yes, Thackeray." "He looks at you the way he looks at you." "I know. My mom said cats don't usually do that. This one does." The boy was quiet. He said, "I'm glad you have him." Elowen put down the mullah. She looked at the boy. She looked at the cat on the bench. She looked at the studio, the bench Thackeray had built her, the cedar chest he had refinished with her one weekend in 2014, the daylight lamp he had wired, the long north window, and she felt, for the first time in 4 years, the specific peace of a person who has come back to her own life on her own terms. "I'm glad I have him too," she said. She did not mention to the boy what the cat had done. She did not mention the yarn set down on the floor that afternoon in October. She did not mention the 11 days she had stood in the hallway, not opening the drawer. She did not mention the morning at the kitchen sink in November. The boy was 14. The boy was a child. The boy did not need to be told the things he had, by his own existence on her porch in his too large peacoat, helped to make unnecessary. She said only, "He's a serious cat." The boy laughed. The last scene is this. It is the first Saturday in April. The Vance house has its windows open for the first time since November. The cool spring air through the front hall, the small specific smell of the camellias finishing their bloom in the courtyard, the high distant church bells from St. John the Baptist 3 blocks south on Lafayette Square. Elowen has, on the kitchen table, the morning's coffee and a folded newspaper she will not entirely read. She has, on the workbench upstairs, a new commission, a 16th century book of hours that arrived by courier on Tuesday, water damage on 6 folios, with photographs from the dealer and a clear contract and a generous deadline. Iris is coming at noon. Young Thackeray is coming at 1 with his mother, who Elowen has, after some months, persuaded to come in for tea instead of just dropping off her son. Balthazar is on the windowsill of the front parlour. The front parlour is open. The shutters are open. The drapes are tied back. Elowen has been, since February, slowly opening the rooms of the Vance house one by one, not because she needs them, but because she has begun to think that the house should be lived in, all of it, by the woman who lives there. The cat is on the windowsill. He is watching East Jones Street. A neighbour is walking a small dog past the iron gate. A car passes. A woman in a sundress walks by with a baby in a sling. Balthazar watches all of it, with the patient amber regard of a creature who is paying attention to the world he has decided to remain in. Elowen stands in the doorway of the parlour with a cup of coffee in her hand. She watches him. He turns his head. He looks at her. He looks at her with the same fixed, deliberate attention he had given her on a Friday afternoon in October, when he had set down a 5-year-old red yarn ball and abandoned a 5-year-old ritual to do something he had decided needed doing. Then he turns his head back to the street. She watches him. The April light is on his fur. It picks up the silver blue in the dense Nebelung coat, the small particular shimmer that had made Thackeray say, when he had brought him home, "He's got smoke in him, El. Look at that. He's got smoke in him. He has smoke in him." He has also, in some way, Elowen has stopped trying to explain to herself, a great deal of Thackeray. The way he tilts his head when she speaks, the way he announces, with one specific chirp, that the kettle is whistling. The way he disapproves of a dropped fork by looking at it for exactly 2 seconds before looking away. These are not things she imagined. These are things that are, she does not need them to mean anything. She lets them be what they are. Balthazar settles his chin on his front paws. Outside, the small dog has gone. The car has passed. A breeze comes through the open window and lifts the curtain once, gently, and lays it back down. He watches the street. Elowen, in the doorway, watches him. She drinks her coffee.